From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Absolutamente.
We absolutely reject the declaration of the Supreme Electoral Tribunal. We do not recognize any action that is committed by this criminal organization for electoral fraud organized by the government of Juan Orlando Hernandez.
In Honduras, the political crisis is escalating as the government-controlled election commission declares the U.S.-backed incumbent president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, the winner of the contested November 26 presidential election. But the Organization of American States is calling for a new election, and the opposition party is calling for nationwide protests today. We'll go to Tegucigalpa to speak with the spokesperson of the Alliance Against the Dictatorship, then to President Trump's tax plan.
This is going to be one of the great gifts to the middle-income people of this country that they've ever gotten for Christmas.
A Christmas gift for the middle class or for President Trump's family and the lawmakers whose votes he's courting? We'll look at how Tennessee Senator Bob Corker abruptly changed his mind and announced his support for Trump's tax plan after the addition of a last-minute provision that would personally enrich the Tennessee senator. Then, after the FCC votes to repeal landmark net neutrality rules, what's next in the fight for a free and open Internet? All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Republican-controlled Congress is poised to pass a massive rewrite of the U.S. tax code after Tennessee Republican Senator Bob Corker abruptly reversed his position and announced his support for the tax plan. Corker's switch came as Republican leaders added a last-minute provision that slashes taxes on income from real estate LLCs. Corker is a real estate mogul. Florida Senator Marco Rubio also pledged to vote yes after winning an expansion of the child tax credit, which Republicans reluctantly granted. The New York Times reports those who will most benefit from the Republicans' tax bill are big corporations, multimillionaires, private equity managers, private schools, liquor stores, lawyers, tax accountants, and President Trump and his family. We'll have more on the Republican tax bill later in the broadcast. The tax bill's impending passage came as a top UN monitor issued a scathing report on poverty in the United States, saying the Trump administration and Republicans are turning the U.S. into the world champion of extreme inequality. Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, warned the tax bill will transfer vast amounts of wealth to the richest earners while making life harder for the 41 million Americans living in poverty.
I think the American dream is moving fairly rapidly towards the American illusion, because social mobility in this country is now extremely low by any Western standards. If you're born in poverty, guess where you're going to end up? In poverty.
In Honduras, the Supreme Electoral Tribunal has declared President Juan Orlando Hernandez as the official winner of the November 26 presidential election, despite widespread allegations of vote rigging by opposition parties and international observers. The government-controlled tribunal concluded Hernandez beat opposition candidate Salvador Nasrallah by just over 1.5 percentage points, after early counts put Nasrallah in the lead by 5 points when the Electoral Commission then abruptly shut the counting down. The Organization of American States has called for a new election, saying the first election was so filled with irregularities that it's impossible to declare a winner. Sunday's announcement sparked calls for renewed protests following weeks of uncertainty about the election result. On Friday, police fired tear gas at protesters who barricaded roads in Tegucigalpa, demanding a recount. This is Margarita Sauceda.
We want them to recognize Salvador Nasrallah now as president. He is our president. We elected him as our president because he's the best we have. He'll be a change for this country.
After headlines, we'll go to Honduras to speak with independent journalist Alan Nairn. We'll also talk to history professor and human rights specialist Dana Frank and a spokesperson for the Alliance Against the Dictatorship in Honduras. In Pakistan, a pair of attackers stormed a Christmas service at a church in the city of Quetta on Sunday, killing 9 people, wounding more than 50 others. Witnesses say one of the attackers detonated a suicide bomb while the other sprayed gunfire on worshippers before he was shot dead by police. ISIS later claimed responsibility for the attack. In Afghanistan, at least 11 police officers were killed Sunday after Taliban fighters stormed a checkpoint in the city of Lashkar Gah. Elsewhere, a suicide bomber targeted a NATO convoy in Kandahar car, killing a woman who died when her home collapsed due to the blast. In Gaza Strip, thousands of Palestinians attended a funeral Saturday for a 29-year-old double amputee who was killed during protests against Israel and the Trump administration. Witnesses say an Israeli sniper shot 29-year-old Ibrahim Abu Thuraya in the head as he protested nonviolently. At the time of his death, Abu Thuraya was in a wheelchair. He lost both legs and a kidney in 2008 during an assault by a U.S.-made Israeli helicopter gunship. He was one of 4 Palestinians killed by Israeli forces during protests on Friday. The United Nations top human rights official is investigating whether Burma's military and the country's de facto leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, committed genocide against Burma's Rohingya Muslim minority. Speaking with the BBC, Zayed Ra'ad al-Hussein called for an international criminal investigation into a campaign that saw more than 600,000 Rohingyas flee to neighboring Bangladesh to escape rape, murder and arson.
Given the scale of the military operation, clearly these would have to be decisions taken at a high enough level. And then there's the crime of omission, that if it came to your knowledge that this was being committed and you did nothing to stop it, then you could be culpable as well for that.
In Chile, billionaire former President Sebastián Piñera easily won a new presidential term Sunday in a runoff vote that pitted him against Senator Alejandro Guillier. During his previous term, Piñera sparked massive protests by unions and student groups over his move to privatize public services, including education. Back in the United States, Nevada Democratic lawmaker Ruben Kihuen said Saturday he will not seek re-election next year as a 4th woman stepped forward to accuse the freshman Congress member of unwanted sexual touching and sexual harassment. Kihuen, who denies the charges, made his announcement a day after the House Ethics Committee said it had launched an investigation. Carolina Panthers owner Jerry Richardson said he's put his team up for sale after the NFL said Friday it has launched an investigation into allegations of his racist comments and sexual harassment. Among the accusations reported by Sports Illustrated, Richardson ordered female employees to wear jeans to work and to line up for his inspection, telling them to, quote, "show me how you wiggle to get those jeans up." Special counsel Robert Mueller has obtained tens of thousands of emails from members of Donald Trump's presidential transition team, adding to speculation about whether more indictments could follow in the wake of the arrests of General Michael Flynn, Paul Manafort, and 2 other former Trump officials. Axios reports the emails include documents from 7 different accounts, including one operated by Trump's senior advisor and son-in-law, Jared Kushner. At the White House Sunday, President Trump blasted Mueller's move, saying the situation was not looking good. But Trump said he has no plans to fire Mueller.
My people were very upset about it. I can't imagine there's anything on him, frankly, because, as we said, there's no collusion. There's no collusion whatsoever. But a lot of lawyers thought that was pretty sad.
One of Trump's lawyers said in a letter to congressional leaders that Mueller had improperly received the emails, prompting a rare statement from Mueller, who defended his actions as part of an ongoing criminal investigation. The spat came as Congressmember Adam Schiff, the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, accused Republicans of maneuvering to end the committee's investigation into Trump-Russia ties. The Trump administration's barred top federal health officials from using 7 words or phrases relating to abortion, sexuality, and science in official documents. The Washington Post broke the news on Friday, citing an anonymous whistleblower who says policy analysts at the Centers for Disease Control were told of the banned words at a meeting last week. The words are fetus, entitlement, vulnerable, diversity, transgender, evidence-based, and science-based. In a statement, Kayleigh Hansen-Long of NARAL Pro-Choice America said, quote, forbidding scientists and researchers from using medically accurate terminology in order to push an extreme ideological agenda is more dystopia than United States of America. In California, fire officials say the Thomas Fire, the biggest of several blazes currently raging in the southern part of the state, is on track to become the largest wildfire in California's modern history. Cal Fire officials say the fire is less than half contained, with 18,000 structures still under threat. The Thomas Fire has consumed an area larger than New York City, and at least 2 deaths are blamed on the fire. Climate scientists have linked California's unprecedented wildfires in December to warmer, drier conditions brought on by global warming. In Georgia, a fire at an underground electrical facility knocked out power at Atlanta International Airport for 11 hours Sunday, stranding tens of thousands of passengers, plunging terminals into darkness, and canceling more than 1,500 flights at the world's busiest airport. The blackout left some passengers trapped aboard grounded planes for more than 6 hours. And on Capitol Hill, police arrested 7 DACA recipients and one of their allies Friday as they held a nonviolent sit-in protest inside the offices of Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer of New York and Republican Congressmember Carlos Curbelo of Florida. The activists were demanding the lawmakers commit to voting no on a spending bill this month unless it includes a version of the DREAM Act without concessions on funding for the border wall or enhanced border security. This is activist Erica Andiola speaking at the start of Friday's protests in Senator Schumer's office.
The DREAM Act can pass in December 22nd as part of the spending bill. Schumer can do this. He has the power to do it, and we're tired of him playing political games with our lives. And that's why we're here, and we're going to stay here, and we're going to stay in jail until he does that.
The activists remain in jail since Friday and could face possible deportation. They say they'll remain on hunger strike until their demands are met. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show with the escalating political crisis in Honduras. On Sunday night, the government-controlled Electoral Commission declared the U.S.-backed incumbent President Juan Orlando Hernandez as the official winner of the contested November 26 presidential election. The commission made the announcement while opposition candidate Salvador Nasrallah was on a plane traveling to the United States to prevent evidence of election fraud to the OAS and State Department. The opposition party is now calling for nationwide protests, and the Organization of American States has called for a new election. This is Jorge Tuto Quiroga, head of the Electoral Observer Mission of the OAS.
The Electoral Observer Mission considered that it has observed a process of low electoral quality and therefore cannot settle the doubts over what has been announced today. The mission regrets once again the incidents of violence that have occurred in the elections, in different phases of the electoral process, and calls once again for all actors to stay calm and act responsibly.
Protests erupted after the November 26 election when the government-controlled Electoral Commission stopped tallying votes once the count showed opposition candidate Nasrallah ahead. After a few days, the Electoral Commission then claimed Hernandez was ahead. Human rights groups say as many as 22 people have been killed and more than 1,200 detained in the nationwide protests since. Well, for more, we're joined in Tegucigalpa by award-winning independent journalist Alan Nairn, as well as by Rodolfo Pastor, the spokesperson for the Alliance Against the Dictatorship, the opposition party, represented by Salvador Nasrallah. And in Washington, D.C., Dana Frank is with us, professor of history at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Let's begin with Rodolfo Pastor in Tegucigalpa. Rodolfo Pastor, you're spokesperson for the opposition party that is led by Salvador Nasrallah, who is in a plane headed to Washington when the government-controlled Electoral Commission announced that the incumbent president, Hernandez, has won. What is your response, and what's happening in the streets right now?
Well, what's happened since last night, it's early morning here in Honduras, is obviously the announcement by the tribunal, a very unilateral announcement. Only the president of the tribunal was on camera, which is very, very atypical since it's a collegiate body and there is 3 magistrates for the tribunal. And yet it was the president of the tribunal who is more directly linked to Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was to make an announcement, which was also atypical since it was not an official announcement. It was basically him communicating the final results of the count, and yet it was not the tribunal coming out and saying Juan Orlando Hernandez has been elected president of Honduras. What happened since then is, of course, the alliance has rejected this declaration. We do not consider the tribunal by now to be a legitimate institution here in Honduras. It has been that way for a while. We have questioned the credibility of the tribunal, the the capacity of the tribunal to provide credible results since before the elections. And of course, by now, more than 3 weeks since the elections, we are very concerned that the tribunal has played a very, very important role in manipulating the results. And this is something that the OAS has also come out and spoken about in its report. The alliance has rejected the results and has called for the population to stay on the streets, to keep mobilizing, since this is our way of putting pressure on the regime so that they can actually rectify. Since the announcement by the tribunal and then the statements made by the OAS calling for a new election, what we've heard here in Honduras is basically Juan Orlando Hernandez moving forward saying, well, I am now the winner. All the front pages this morning on all the major newspapers call him the new president of Honduras for the next 4 years. They barely mention the fact that the OAS came out with a very, very strong statement questioning the tribunal, questioning the process, and calling for new elections.
Alan Nairn, you've been covering the events in Tegucigalpa through this election. Can you talk about Nasrallah, where he was when this announcement was made? You saw him getting on the plane in Tegucigalpa?
Yeah, I spoke to him as he was boarding, and he clearly didn't expect this. He was on the way to Washington to plead his case. One thing that shocked many people here was that President Hernandez made this announcement not only while Nasrallah was on the plane, but one day after Hernandez's own sister was killed in a helicopter crash. But he seized the moment to spring his proclamation of victory. The declaration by the Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro, was remarkable because the OAS is historically a policy tool of the United States, and he is clearly bucking the will of the United States, which has been backing Hernandez throughout this process. Hernandez is close to General Kelly in the White House. I think this took some courage on the Secretary General's part, because during the recent weeks I've been talking to some former Latin American heads of state who've made it clear that the OAS has been hesitant about going against the U.S. on this, but now the Secretary General has issued a very strong statement, making it clear that the computer system of the Electoral Commission was penetrated. It was an invitation to fraud, and the OAS report didn't even address what seems to be the dominant emerging evidence, which is that much of the fraud was done by simple ballot box stuffing on the local level by the ruling party. And as I previously mentioned on an earlier show, on the 30th of November, one of the technicians inside the electoral system sent out a private message in which he stated, "Fraude ya se hizo," the fraud has now been done. This OAS stance by the Secretary General put some pressure on the Honduran government, which has bitterly attacked him now, saying he's inciting violence. But more importantly, it may make it difficult for the White House, which will have a hard time explaining in any rational way why it would now back Hernandez as the OAS is calling for new elections.
And can you talk about the role of Heidi Fulton, the charge d'affaires, who, as in many countries around the world, President Trump has not appointed ambassadors, and so she plays that role. The significance of Nasrallah being on a plane to the U.S., what he was planning to do at the State Department and the OAS, and her role in Honduras right now, as she is deeply involved with speaking with both sides.
Well, just a few days earlier, she had appeared alongside the head of the Electoral Tribunal, a de facto endorsement to the partial not clean recount they were doing, and she was widely denounced for that. It's clear that behind the scenes she's been working on behalf of Hernandez, and the U.S. Has not denounced the killings by the security forces. Last night, I went out on the streets as people were taking to the streets and burning tires, and the dominant force I ran into were the military police, which is the most repressive and notorious element of the armed forces. They're the ones most closely and personally linked to President Hernandez. They were carrying live ammunition. They told me they had orders to open fire on demonstrators if they gave them any trouble. And although the Pentagon has been claiming in recent years that the U.S. has not been training the military police, a number of those I ran into said they had gotten their training from Fort Benning. It's partially necessary for them to use this extremely repressive force now because 2 weeks ago the police rebelled and said they would no longer carry out repression. And other elements of the Army I've been talking to have been saying, rank-and-file troops have been saying that they are reluctant also. I've never actually seen in any other country a security force that was less ideologically strong and less committed to their own leadership. When you ask them who their families voted for back in the countryside where they come from, very few of them say Hernandez. Most of them say their families voted for Nasrallah, at least among those I've talked to. And many of them seem to identify more as poor working people where they come from, as opposed to being members of the institution. And I think the Hernandez government and also Washington have to see this. And if the popular resistance is large and persistent enough, this government may have some difficulty holding on, even with U.S. backing.
And Dana Frank, professor at University of California, Santa Cruz, you've been closely following everything here. You say this election is being stolen.
Oh, well, I think we have to say there's certainly evidence of fraud and a great concern about who controlled those tally sheets, who controlled the computers. I certainly would support what the OAS is saying, which is we don't have evidence of a clear election here that could be certified. And there's a long history of electoral fraud in Honduras going into this. Let's remember that. And Juan Orlando himself has a long history of subverting the rule of law, overthrowing the Supreme Court. Let's remember his election itself is illegal. It's a criminal act in violation of the Constitution, which says it's an immediate criminal act to even advocate re-election. So going into that, let's remember that. So I think that we have to listen to what the opposition is saying, listen to what the OAS is saying, and say they need a new election. There's way too much water under the bridge in terms of that electoral commission. And it's the foxes are guarding the chicken coop here, and the votes from the chickens. And so I think we really have to listen to what the opposition was saying. And remember that the Honduran people have very few ways of expressing themselves at this point. People say, well, why are they going into the streets? It's not like they can petition Congress. Juan Orlando Hernandez controls all the reins of power, the Supreme Court, the Attorney General, the military. Most of the police, we don't really know, as Mr. Nairn was saying, what the position of the military and the police are going to be. This one unit, 400 of the Cobras, did rebel. So, I think just supporting what he was saying, we have to pay attention to what the United States is going to do here. They have such a long history of giving a green light to Juan Orlando's criminal re-election, of being silent about the repression since the elections, and outrageously certifying 2 days after the election, as it was already clear that there were major problems with the election, certifying that human rights conditions on aid to Honduras had been met. I mean, that was astonishing. And also on December 10th, which is International Human Rights Day, Heidi Fulton, the acting ambassador, chose to use that to praise the Juan Hernandez's government for its advances on human rights. So they're sending clear signals about who they care about and support and who they don't care about and support, and this lack of respect for basic human rights in Honduras. So all eyes are on the United States right now. Will it respect the OAS? And, there were some suggestions that the OAS was going to certify this election, and when it hasn't, I think, what is the United States going to do? The EU has actually come out last night supporting the Electoral Commission very embarrassingly and pretty much repeating exactly what the Honduran government said. And the EU has a long history, like the United States, of supporting Juan Orlando's government. the other place to look here is the U.S. Congress, which there have been very, very strong voices about the appearance of a major fraud. There have been very strong voices condemning the repression, and especially Congresswoman Schakowsky, Congressmember Keith Ellison. There are already 68 members of Congress that have said cut police and military aid going into the elections. Senator Leahy, Senator Reid, Senator Merkley, and many others in the Senate have expressed concern about potential fraud. They've expressed concern about the state security forces. So we also really want to pay attention to this congressional voice pushing back against the State Department. Remember that Congress controls the purse strings, and U.S. money is funding these state security forces. U.S. money is of course, of the State Department. It's the U.S. State Department that has been continually celebrating Juan Orlando's dictatorship as if he was, as John Kelly put it, a great guy and a good friend. I mean, Kelly said that as recently as May, and that's Trump's chief of staff.
Rodolfo Pastor in Tegucigalpa, you are the opposition spokesperson, the Alliance Against the Dictatorship. Can you explain what Nasrallah is doing in Washington and what you're calling for to happen now in the streets, and explain how broad your coalition is?
Well, the coalition is very broad. What evidently happened here is we realized, different political parties and social movements, we realized that we were dealing with a dictatorship, that this was no longer a normal political process where we were just competing for political power through elections. This man who has come to power during the last 8 years as a result of the 2009 coup, when he became president of Congress first and started packing the courts and different state institutions, has concentrated so much power under his executive office that we are no longer dealing with a normal president here in Honduras. And so we started coming together throughout the last 4 years, when he, as president, has been increasingly abusive, authoritarian, and repressive. And we realized that the only way to confront this guy on an election that he pretty much controls was by coming together and building this broad coalition, which brings very odd partners to the party. It's, well, of course, I am a member of Libre, and this is a party that was born from the resistance to the coup back in 2009, and is a left-off center party, basically. And the coalition also brings together PINU, which is a small social democrat party that has been in Congress for a long time, but has not played a major role in Honduran politics. And, of course, PAC, led by Mr. Nasrallah, which was also a party that is born from the coup, but as a right-off center party based on an anti-corruption narrative. It's a party that, by the way, months before the coalition officially came together as the alliance, was dismantled by the tribunal, led by Mr. Matamoros and under Juan Orlando's direct instructions. So we come together and we start getting social movements from around Honduras coming to us and also saying, hey, listen, we want to be part of this, and we need to organize against this, because we know we are going into an electoral process that we have stated both nationally and internationally did not meet any basic conditions for it to be free or fair. And we went into this game knowing that they controlled the field, that we were clearly going against the odds here. But we also knew that the rejection of the Honduran population as a whole against Juan Orlando is huge. And there was absolutely no way that if these elections were in any way clean or transparent, that Juan Orlando was going to be the winner. And that's currently the position. And it's also, it might seem contradictory, but we are not exactly celebrating the fact that the OAS has come out and asked for a new process to be organized, because we won these past elections. We clearly did so, even against a massive fraud and the control that Juan Orlando has of the institutions that organized the elections. The Honduran people came out massively and voted against Juan Orlando and for the alliance. And this is something that we want to make very clear. We need to respect this. We need to respect the fact that the popular will was very clearly expressed, and that since the elections and since it became so evident that there had been fraud going on before, during, and after the elections, there has been significant repression by state police and army forces. And as a result, we have victims of this repression. We have 22 people who have been killed, many others who have been injured. And as both Dana and the journalist pointed out, this is a critical moment for us, and we are not willing to just accept that Juan Orlando should, by some miracle, agree that we are to hold new elections, in which, of course, he would lose if they were organized by an objective, impartial tribunal. So we are very concerned with, number one, the reaction that Juan Orlando might have against what happened last night. Of course, he seems to be plowing forward and basically ignoring what the OAS has said. And number two, yes, what will the U.S. say about this? Now, Mr. Nasrallah is visiting Washington in order to meet with Secretary General Almagro. He is also to meet with officials at the
Secretary
State Department
General of the OAS.
That's right. That's right. And what we are, this happened before the announcement was made. We did expect the announcement to be made. We expected it to be made today, Monday, and not Sunday night. And yet it did not come as a surprise to us. And we have been getting ready for this announcement to be made by the tribunal. And we do consider that the OAS report gives us a certain boost. And I speak on behalf of the Honduran population that has been out in the streets for 3 weeks now, because we understand that there is a voice of hope out there, and that the international community is still paying attention to us. We were obviously very upset with the position that the European Union representative here came out and stated last night, like Professor Frank stated. And yet, this is not. We must make it clear: this is not the official position of the electoral observation mission that they have here. And I understand that right now, as we speak, we have Marisa Matias, the president of the commission, speaking from Brussels about this. And I think that they will come out strongly stating that the electoral process was plagued by fraud.
Well, we're going to continue to cover this again tomorrow on Democracy Now! As events unfold with the opposition leader, who many believe won the election, the Electoral College, the Electoral Commission, shutting down the vote for a period when it was announced Salvador Nasrallah was 5 percentage points ahead. He is in Washington now. Rodolfo Pastor, spokesperson for the opposition party Alliance Against the Dictatorship, Alan Nair, in the streets of Tegucigalpa, independent journalist, and Dana Frank, professor at University of California, Santa Cruz. Thanks so much for being with us. When we come back, did Republican lawmakers include a last-minute provision in the tax plan to personally enrich Tennessee Senator Bob Corker in order to secure his support for the tax bill? Stay with us. Reap the Wild Wind by Ultravox here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We turn to the Republican plan to overhaul the U.S. tax code, which appears to be a step closer to passing, after Tennessee Republican Senator Bob Corker abruptly switched his position and announced his support for the tax plan. The surprise move by the Republican senator came after a controversial last-minute addition to the bill that would personally enrich him. It would slash taxes on income from real estate LLCs. Corker's a real estate mogul. On Sunday, while speaking with ABC's George Stephanopoulos, Senate Majority Whip John Cornyn pushed back against accusations that lawmakers slipped a Corker kickback into the bill.
Picking out one piece in a 1,000-page bill and saying, well, this is going to benefit somebody, I just think takes the whole bill out of context.
Well, but except that this provision wasn't included either the House or the Senate bill. It apparently was added at the last minute. Why was that done? Why was it necessary to include that provision?
Well, we were working very hard. It was a very intense process. As I said, the Democrats refused to participate. And what we've tried to do is cobble together the votes we needed to get this bill passed.
That was Senate Majority Whip John Cornyn. Arizona Republican Senator John McCain will miss the vote, so though President Trump says he can return from Arizona. Yes, he's gone to Arizona, Senator McCain, to recover from chemotherapy treatments for his brain tumor. The New York Times reports those who will most benefit from the Republicans' tax bill are big corporations, multimillionaires, private equity managers, private schools, liquor stores, lawyers, tax accountants, and President Trump and his family. The tax bill will slash the corporate tax rate from 35% down to 21%. It'll raise an exception on the estate tax to $22 million, meaning people with tens of millions of dollars will receive a major tax cut. It would also keep intact the so-called carried interest loophole, which massively benefits private equity managers, and it'll slash the tax rate for so-called pass-through income, benefiting Senator Corker, President Trump's family, and other real estate moguls. As the New York Times reports, numerous industries will benefit from the Republican tax overhaul, but perhaps none as dramatically as the industry where Mr. Trump earned his riches, commercial real estate. In contrast, the Times reports, those will be most hurt by the tax plan are the elderly, low-income, families, immigrants, people buying health insurance, the island of Puerto Rico, and homeowners in the states of New York, New Jersey, and California. The tax bill will repeal the individual health insurance mandate, which experts say will cause insurance premiums to skyrocket. The Congressional Budget Office estimates 13 million Americans are projected to lose their health insurance under the plan. It'll also impose a new requirement that families must provide a Social Security number to claim the child tax credit, meaning many undocumented parents will no longer be able to receive this credit, even if their children are U.S. citizens, because the parents don't have a Social Security number. It used to be that you had to put in the children's Social Security number. Florida Senator Marco Rubio announced his support for the tax plan Friday after an expansion of the child tax credit, even though the expansion won't benefit the children of undocumented parents. Republican lawmakers are now pressing forward for a final vote on Trump's tax plan this week. For more, we're joined here in New York by Kalia Kuno, co-founder and co-director of Cooperation Jackson, network of worker cooperatives in Jackson, Mississippi, author of Jackson Rising, The Struggle for Economic Democracy and Black Self-Determination in Jackson, Mississippi. And in Denver, we're joined by David Sirota. He's senior editor for investigations at the International Business Times, and he's the one who broke the story Donald Trump and GOP leaders could be enriched by last-minute tax break inserted into final bill. David, why don't we begin with you? Explain what you discovered.
Sure. This is all about pass-through income. It's income that's generated from limited liability companies, LLCs, and other kinds of partnerships. And basically what happened was that the House, in its bill, had a sweeping tax reduction for income earned from those kinds of entities. And the Senate bill, and this is the key point, the Senate bill that Bob Corker voted on and voted against included various restrictions in the bill designed to prevent a tax cut for income earned through these pass-through entities from those pass-through entities that aren't employing people. It included provisions basically trying to limit the tax cut only to LLCs that essentially pay wages. The idea being that the tax cut was supposed to be structured to companies that are actually employing people. So here's what happens. Corker votes against that bill with those restrictions. Then the House and Senate comes together and negotiates a final compromise bill, a final bill in the conference report. And magically, a provision shows up in the final conference report that the framework goes with the Senate provisions, seeming to have limits on the tax cuts for it, but it included a relatively narrow loophole that said the tax cuts could still effectively be accessed by LLCs that have few to no employees in it. And tax experts tell us that that is a particularly big benefit to real estate LLCs, the kind that President Trump has, the kind that Jared Kushner has, the kind that a series of top lawmakers, including Bob Corker, has. These are LLCs with real estate holdings in the LLCs generating rental income. So when that bill came out on Friday afternoon, the conference report with that special provision in it, all of a sudden, Bob Corker said that he is now switching his vote from no to yes on the final bill. And this is a provision that could potentially, in a very serious way, enrich him. Economists have told us he could make between $500,000 and $1 million in tax cuts from this bill based on his own filings. Now, did Corker change his vote because this provision was in the bill? That's unclear, but that's what a lot of critics are asking. A lot of folks are wondering, why did he change his vote? He had originally voted against the bill, saying he was voting against it because it would explode the deficit. All of a sudden, he changes his vote to yes when the provision is in the final bill, and that bill, the final bill, explodes the deficit according to the Joint Committee on Taxation. And Bob Corker has not offered up a very clear answer as to why he has switched his vote.
So, David Sirota, this is particularly important, right? Because Bob Corker, the Republican Tennessee senator, who took this defiant stand and said he would not support the tax bill, switching his vote, is retiring, going back to private business in Tennessee.
It's absolutely, he is a pivotal player in this. And it's hard to overstate how important he is. You had mentioned that John McCain is probably not going to be there for the vote, which means that 2 Senate Republican votes could basically kill this $1.5 trillion tax cut. So if Corker was against the bill, as he was against the original bill, and one other senator, whether it's Jeff Flake, who said he's undecided, or Susan Collins, this bill would go down. So in other words, Bob Corker potentially has the entire Senate bill in his hands. And so, and that clip that you heard of Senator Cornyn saying, asked directly, why was this provision put in? And he basically says, we were trying to cobble together the votes. This has raised a lot of questions about what is motivating Bob Corker. And then late last night, Corker wrote a letter facing this firestorm of criticism about what he has done. He wrote a letter to Senator Orrin Hatch, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, basically suggesting he didn't know about this provision, demanding answers about how the provision got into the bill. And what's really important about this is it's a very unusual event where you have a Republican senator who potentially has the fate of President Trump's entire tax bill in his hands, now publicly putting pressure on his own party, demanding answers about this provision, a situation that potentially suggests that Corker's vote may still be in flux.
Very significant. Also having to admit he hadn't read this. He didn't know it was in there, if in fact that's true, and demanding an explanation of how this provision got in that would so handsomely profit Corker himself.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting how you view this. I mean, Bob Corker told us in a series of phone calls that he hadn't even bothered to read the bill that he had already previously announced he would support. He, at one point, criticized this provision and then tried to walk back the criticism. And so, you know, some people look at this and say, well, Bob Corker is telling the truth. He didn't read the bill, which folks will say that that's incredible that he's going to vote for a bill he hasn't even read, but he didn't read the bill, and we believe him, and he wants answers about the provision. There's another way to look at it and say, you know, how would a guy who is a real estate mogul who has complex investments not know about a giant potential tax cut inserted into the bill directed at precisely the kind of business that he's in, and that his explanation doesn't make much sense, and that this may all just be a smokescreen? It's really hard to tell what's going on.
Kali Akuno, you're up from Jackson, Mississippi. You're deeply involved with issues of economic democracy. Talk about this tax bill. What does it mean?
Well, I mean, it's one of the greatest transfers of wealth from the working class to the rich, I think, in history, not just American history, but history. I think when you look at all the details that are coming out and all of these little backdoor deals, these plausible denials by folks like Corker, they only go so far, but the details are there. You know, this is going to help a narrow sliver of folks within the United States, and folks like, you know, myself and a lot of the folks in Mississippi. We're going to be drastically hurt by this bill. You mentioned one of the kind of the fallouts, which is already happening around millions of people losing their health care. I'm likely going to be one of those people as a result of this tax bill. When I filed for, you know, my application, it said that my rates were going up from $900 a month, which is already outrageous, to damn near $2,000. Excuse me for that, but just the emotion of what I'm going to have to deal with. And given my income, that largely makes it almost impossible for me. And I earn a little bit more than the average person in Mississippi. So you can just imagine that there's only one health care provider now that's going to be within the affordable health care markets in Mississippi. And if that's the rate that they're charging as a result of, you know, the pullbacks from Trump with the subsidies that he already had announced, and you look at what this tax bill is basically going to do, we're going to be suffering this next period immensely.
What about Roy Moore losing, Doug Jones winning? Even with Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act being passed only by Democrats, President Obama said we will wait for Scott Brown, who had been elected in Massachusetts, a Republican senator, to be seated before we go for this major vote, because the people of Massachusetts have spoken. But Mitch McConnell has clearly said that this vote will take place before Christmas, so that what that will lead to is Doug Jones, who was elected in the special election, will not be able to participate in this.
Well, I think Doug was trying to aim to allay some fears yesterday on his CNN interview, when he basically said that he was going to look to try to find some common interest, you know, with the Republicans. He was clearly aiming at a re-election bid, you know, coming up in 2020. So it's also another case. We're not quite sure, even if he's seated, honestly, right now, where he would vote. I mean, he's clearly what we would call in the old school days a Dixiecrat, and I think he self-described himself as a blue dog Democrat. So it's not quite clear. We would hope that he would be one of the people who stands in opposition to this tax bill, and we would hope that Coker would come to his senses and also oppose it. But that's a lot of hope, and I think, you know, that we're kind of stretching thin. I think the real question is how are we going to organize in the long term to not only defeat this tax bill, but they're coming for Medicaid, they're coming for Medicare, they're coming from Social Security. Paul Ryan has already said that they're going to look at that next year. So we got a serious fight on our hands that we got to get prepared for.
They will so disadvantage states and cities that they will then be forced to cut services.
That's right. That's right. I mean, they're already looking at that. And then in our case in Mississippi, we have a Tea Party super legislative majority in our state legislature. They're already looking to add more cuts to what the federal government is also doing with this tax cut. So for places like Jackson, it could be severe austerity the next couple of years. So that's something that we hope is not the case, but we're kind of gearing up, expecting that, you know, prepare for the worst.
I'd like to ask you to stay after the show so we can post to particularly looking at Jackson, Mississippi, and what you've done there and how the Trump administration impacts that. But before we go, a very quick comment on your deep concerns about white supremacy in the United States right now under President Trump.
It's not just here. Let me state that. I was recently in Europe, and I witnessed reports on the fascist threats in Italy, and now there's a far-right member sitting in the Austrian government. I have deep concerns about this playing out throughout the world, but particularly here, looking at Donald Trump, there's white supremacy and then there's neoliberalism, which is emerging, as I would argue, and I think many people would argue, with a serious fascism that could threaten life on this planet as we know it. So it's not just a minor concern. I think it's a deep concern that all of us should have.
I want to thank you for being with us. Kali Akuno is with Cooperation Jackson and has written the book Jackson Rising, The Struggle for Economic Democracy and Black Self-Determination in Jackson, Mississippi. And I also want to thank David Sirota, who broke the story in the International Business Times about Senator Corker and his surprise switch vote on the taxes, though who knows, he might switch back, being opposed to the tax bill, with a provision that was put in that would personally enrich him. We'll continue to follow that story. When we come back, what's next in the fight to preserve net neutrality, the principle of a free and open internet? Stay with us. Make a Circuit with Me by the Polecats here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show looking at the next steps in the fight to keep the internet free and open. The Federal Communications Commission, known as the FCC, voted last week to dismantle landmark net neutrality rules established in 2015 after widespread organizing and protests by free internet advocates. These rules required internet service providers to treat web content equally, not block or prioritize some content over others in return for payment. The repeal of these rules was widely opposed by the American public, with more than 20 million people submitting comments to the FCC. But Trump's chairman of the FCC, Ajit Pai, had lobbied heavily to repeal the rules. On Thursday, Ajit Pai, a former Verizon attorney, was joined by two fellow Republican commissioners, and the FCC voted 3-2 for repeal. The FCC's vote to repeal net neutrality is the latest and most controversial of a series of changes led by Chairman Ajit Pai. Over the last year, he has also loosened rules aimed at limiting media consolidation and scaled back a program aimed at expanding broadband access among low-income Americans. For more, we're joined by Maya Wiley. She's Senior Vice President for Social Justice and Professor of Public and Urban Policy at the New School. Welcome back to Democracy Now!
Thank you,
Professor Wiley. Talk about your concerns. This vote that happened on Thursday, is it set in stone? There are still movements all over the country that are pushing back very hard.
Absolutely. Well, let's just start with the fact that this is a devastating blow to all the ways that we've come to understand the Internet. Even those who were part of the founding of the Internet have expressed deep, deep concern for the failure to protect net neutrality. And even though we just got the rules in 2015, the truth is we've been fighting for net neutrality since the mid-2000s. So this isn't really new, and the fact that there was a fight meant that we were essentially seeing some some controls on, in the gentle sense, on internet service providers to do the right thing. So what's happened now is, first of all, you have members of Congress considering whether to use the same act that Donald Trump used to roll back privacy protections regulations that the Obama administration had approved, which allows 60 days for Congress to essentially say, repeal those rules. Now, given the current makeup of the House, obviously, unless more Republicans start to realize that their own constituents will be harmed by these new rules, then we may not see that pass. So
explain how you see what you think is most going to be lost in this rollback.
You know, I think what people have to understand is the internet service providers, of which we have far too few in this country, right? Competition, we should have much more than we have. We don't, because we've essentially granted them monopolies in exchange for providing what's called universal service. What the FCC has done is actually said, you know, we're not even going to put you in the category anymore of being required to provide universal service. We're really going to treat you as an information provider, which, of course, really isn't an accurate way of thinking about internet service provision anymore. But what that really means is we got 62 million Americans in urban areas and 16 million Americans in rural areas that still don't have broadband at home. And essentially saying, OK, and we're not actually going to say universal service to you anymore is one of the big aspects of this new rule that we have to understand. So, and in addition, when you add the content blocking or throttling content, when we have very little competition in the space, it's not like consumers are going to have a choice of, say, going to another provider in very many places to say, well, I want to be sure that you're not going to block my content.
Do you see whole cities getting short shrift here?
Well, I think all over the country we're going to see...
Especially poor areas.
Especially poor areas are already in trouble, right? I mean, we should understand that there's still fundamentally a digital divide in this country, both in urban and rural areas. And as I said, in urban areas, it's 62 million people. A big part of that for urban areas is cost. So for communities of color, what we're talking about is seeing costs go up, right? I mean, because you're essentially saying to providers, you can actually charge, you're going to charge companies, but folks are going to speed up their content potentially. But that means that they're going to pass those costs off to consumers, which is going to make it even more costly. And we in the United States pay more for less. You know, we pay a lot more for our internet and get a lot poorer service.
Then you have right here Eric Schneiderman, the New York Attorney General, threatening to sue to block the repeal, and a dozen states' attorneys generals investigating, quote, fake comments.
Yes.
Explain.
So we have at least what have been uncovered is about 2 million comments by bots, which are not people, ergo the name bot, that essentially, though the allegations, but these bots posed as actual people and submitted comments. That's identity theft. And so what Eric Schneiderman was doing was saying, I'm investigating the New York State crime of identity theft because we've had residents whose identities were falsely used to make comments that they weren't making. He had asked the FCC to hold back on passing the rule until he had finished his investigation. They refused. They also refused to have public hearings and allow a public discussion of the new rules. So that's why you're seeing so many attorneys general working to protect their residents whose identities have been stolen.
Minority businesses?
Minority businesses, it's a big issue because, as we know, 1 out of 3 women-owned businesses is owned by a black woman. And immigrant businesses are amongst the fastest growing along with black women businesses. If you have to pay to get your content, your services, your products to customers faster and therefore compete, and you're a small business, that means you're in trouble. And that's going to kill some of the innovation we're seeing in communities of color.
But you say it's not a done deal.
It's not a done deal. This fight is far from over. We're also going to see lawsuits from the Free Press. We're going to see lawsuits from the ACLU. So in addition to Congress, of course, we should be fighting Congress to pass legislation to reestablish it. But there's a lot of fighting to come.
Maya Wiley, Senior Vice President for Social Justice, Professor of Public and Urban Policy at the New School. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Produced by Renee Feltz, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gaddis, Dina Sam, Malkoff, John Hamilton. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.